You are not grieving a relationship. You are grieving a fantasy you built entirely inside your own mind. And that distinction, that single, uncomfortable distinction, is the one that will either set you free or keep you imprisoned for the next decade of your life. Because here's what nobody is brave enough to say to you directly. The love you are mourning never actually existed, not in the way you experienced it. The late nights you replay, the words you overanalyzed, the potential you were absolutely certain was there, just beneath the surface, just one conversation away from finally becoming real. That was not love. That was construction. Your mind took raw material, attention, proximity, moments of genuine connection, and built an entire future out of it. Furnished it, moved into it, started living there, and then reality had the audacity to not match the blueprint. So now you are standing in the wreckage of something that was never actually built, grieving rooms that never existed, mourning a version of someone who only ever lived inside you. That is not weakness. That is what happens when a deeply feeling, deeply intelligent person directs their full capacity for love at a target that was never fully present to receive it. But here's the truth that changes everything. The moment you can see that clearly, without bitterness, without self-pity, without collapsing the truth back into blame, that is the moment you have entered the Sophia Stage. And the Sophia Stage does not ask you to stop loving. It asks you to finally love what is real. You need to hear this with complete honesty. You did not fall in love with a person. You fell in love with potential, with who they could have been if they had chosen differently, with who you believed they were in their best moments, which you then decided was their truest self, their realist self, the self that would eventually become consistent if you were just patient enough, present enough, extraordinary enough to draw it out permanently. You took their highest moments and built a person out of them. You ignored, excused, and minimized every moment that contradicted that image, not because you were foolish, not because you were blind, but because you needed that version of them to be real more than you needed to see them clearly. And that need, that quiet, desperate, entirely human need, was never about them. It was about you, about the part of you that had decided long before this person ever appeared that love had to be earned through extraordinary effort, that it had to be difficult to be meaningful, that if it came easily, if it was simply and straightforwardly offered without complexity or chase or the particular ache of almost having, it probably wasn't the real thing. You had a template for what love was supposed to feel like, and it felt like longing. It felt like uncertainty. It felt like this specific, exquisite pain of something perpetually just out of reach. So when this person arrived with their ambiguity, their inconsistency, their moments of warmth, followed by inexplicable distance, something in you recognized the pattern and called it love. Here's the first brutal truth. The version of them you loved was a collaborative fiction. You wrote most of it yourself. They contributed the raw material, the charm, the eye contact that lasted a second too long, the conversations that felt like finally being understood, the glimpses of depth that made everything feel possible. But you were the architect. You filled every gap with your own longing. You translated their silences into hidden meaning. You interpreted their unavailability as complexity rather than disinterest. You decided their inconsistency was evidence of an internal battle between who they were and who they could be with you, rather than simply evidence of someone who was never fully invested. You built an entire world inside that gap between who they were and who you believed they were becoming, and you lived there, fully, emotionally, with every ounce of your imagination and hope and capacity for devotion. And the cruelest part, the part that makes this particular grief so disorienting, is that the version you built was genuinely beautiful, genuinely worth loving. The person who lived inside your construction was remarkable, attentive, worthy of everything you were offering, which is why the loss feels so catastrophically real. Because the love was real, completely undeniably, painfully real. It was just directed at someone who existed primarily in your imagination. Here's the second brutal truth. You were not rejected by them, you were rejected by reality, and reality was not being unkind. Reality was not punishing you. Reality was not delivering a verdict on your worth or your lovability or the quality of what you were offering. Reality was simply being accurate. The person you loved as a possibility and the person who actually existed in front of you were two fundamentally different people occupying the same body, and no amount of patience was going to change that. No amount of showing up, of being consistent when they were inconsistent, of loving loudly enough and steadily enough and beautifully enough was ever going to collapse that distance. Because the distance was not a problem to be solved by more love. It was information. Clear, consistent, uncomfortable information that you kept refusing to read because reading it meant dismantling everything you had built. You cannot love a real person into be Kamini, engine the version of them that only lives inside your mind. That is not how people work. That is not how love works. And somewhere underneath all the hoping, you already knew that. You knew it every time the warmth disappeared without explanation. You knew it every time you finished a conversation, feeling less certain than before. You knew it in the way your body tensed slightly when their name appeared, not with pure joy, but with that particular cocktail of excitement and dread that belongs not to love but to hope under threat. You knew, you chose not to know. And that choice, that sustained, effortful, entirely understandable choice, is not something to punish yourself for, but it is something to finally, clearly, unflinchingly see. Because the moment you see it, the moment you stop rewriting the story and read the one that actually happened, something extraordinary occurs. The grief does not disappear, but it changes shape. It stops being about them entirely and starts being about you. About your patterns, about the template you carry for what love is supposed to feel like, about the part of you that confused longing with depth and uncertainty, with passion and unavailability, with mystery worth solving. That is not a wound to be ashamed of. That is a map. And the Sophia Stage is the moment you finally stop staring at the destination you wanted and start reading where the map is actually pointing. It is pointing home, back to yourself, back to the love that was never lost, only misdirected. The address was wrong all along. But you, the one who loved that completely, that devotedly, that extraordinarily, you were never the problem. You were always the treasure. You were simply delivering yourself to the wrong door. Stop pretending you don't know why you held on. You know. On some level, beneath the justifications, beneath the hope, beneath the carefully construed narrative about timing and circumstances and their particular brand of complexity that made everything feel so uniquely difficult to walk away from, you know exactly why you stayed. You have always known. You just needed the pain to become louder than the knowing before you were willing to listen. So let's say it out loud, clearly, without the comfortable softening that usually accompanies this conversation. You held on because letting go meant admitting something you were not ready to admit. Not just that it wasn't going to happen. That would have been manageable. People survive that admission every day. They grieve it, they honor it, and they move forward. What you were not ready to admit was deeper and more destabilizing than simple disappointment. You were not ready to admit that it was never what you told yourself it was, that the story you had been living inside, the one where the love was real and reciprocal, and simply waiting for the right conditions to fully emerge, was a story you had authored almost entirely alone. And that admission did not just threaten the relationship, it threatened your judgment, your perception, your ability to trust what you feel and call it reliable information about reality. Because if you were this wrong about this, if you could feel something this completely and be this mistaken about what it meant, then what else have you been wrong about? What other certainties are built on foundations that cannot hold the weight you have placed on them? That is the question that lives underneath the holding on. And it is terrifying enough to make almost any amount of pain feel preferable to facing it. So you stayed, not out of weakness, out of self-protection, out of a completely understandable human instinct to preserve the version of reality that felt most livable, even when that version was costing you more, daily, than you were unconsciously willing to calculate. Here is the first truth you need to sit with. You did not hold on because the love was too strong to release. You held on because releasing it required you to simultaneously release the identity you had built around it. Think about what that love gave you, beyond the person themselves, beyond the hope of a future together. It gave you a sense of direction, a narrative about where your life was going and what it was building toward. It gave you a container for the enormous depth of feeling that lives inside you, somewhere to put it, something to point it at, a reason to feel things, as intensely as you are capable of feeling them. It gave you, in a strange and rarely acknowledged way, a sense of purpose, loving them, even unrequitedly, even from a distance, even in the agonizing space of almost, made you feel alive in a way that ordinary days without that particular longing did not. And that is the second truth, the one that requires the most courage to face. Some part of you chose the unavailable because available love is genuinely terrifying. Not theoretically terrifying, not in the abstract way that people acknowledge fear of intimacy in therapy and then return to their lives largely unchanged. Concretely, viscerally, in the body terrifying. Because available love, love that is present, mutual, and genuinely willing to know you, can actually see you, all of you, not just the version you curate for someone who is never quite close enough to see the rest, not just the best and brightest and most composed parts of yourself that you present when you know the connection is too fragile to survive your complexity. Available love sees the unfinished parts, the contradictory parts, the parts that are still in process, still uncertain, still quietly ashamed of their own incompleteness, and it chooses you anyway, or it doesn't. And that choosing, or that not choosing, is information you have to live with in real time, without the buffer of distance, without the protective uncertainty of maybe. A love that never fully materializes cannot do any of that. It stays perfect in the possibility. It stays safe in the almost. It never gets close enough to see your flaws with clarity, because it never gets close enough at all. And so you never have to risk the most devastating form of rejection, being fully known and still found lacking. You called it love, and it was, but underneath the love woven into the very fabric of why this particular love and not another, it was also armor. It was a place to invest your heart that felt profound and meaningful and emotionally legitimate, while simultaneously keeping you protected from the specific vulnerability that genuine mutual love requires. You could feel everything. You could love completely. You could be in your own interior experience, fully open, while remaining, in every way that actually counted, safely unreachable. That is not a moral failing. Let that be absolutely clear. It is not evidence that you are broken, or emotionally avoidant, or incapable of real love. It is a survival strategy, a sophisticated, deeply human, entirely understandable survival strategy built in response to real pain that taught you at some point that being fully seen and fully chosen was not something you could safely count on. So you found a way to love that felt complete from the inside while remaining protected from the outside. The Sophia Stage is the moment that strategy becomes visible to you, not with judgment, not with self-condemnation, but with the clear, unflinching, compassionate sight that sees the pattern for exactly what it is and understands, finally, that the protection it offered was always purchased at the price of the very thing you were longing for. You were not protecting yourself from this person's absence. You were protecting yourself from the terror of genuine presence, mutual presence, the kind where two people are actually completely vulnerably there, with no distance to retreat into, no ambiguity to hide behind, no almost to soften, the exposure of being fully dangerously known. That is what you were keeping yourself safe from. And the Sophia Stage does not ask you to punish yourself for it. It asks you to see it completely. And then to ask with real curiosity, with genuine openness, without the answer already decided, whether the protection was ever worth what it cost you. Because on the other side of that question lives something you have not yet allowed yourself to fully want. Not almost love, not possible love, not love that keeps you perpetually reaching without ever arriving. Real love, present love, love that knows your name and says it like it means something. You are not too broken for that. You are not too complicated for that. You are not too much, or too deep, or too feeling for that. You have simply been delivering all of that extraordinary, overwhelming, relentless capacity for love to addresses where no one was home. The Sophia Stage asks one thing of you now. Stop knocking on empty doors and turn around. Letting go of a love that never happened is not the same as letting go of a love that did. It is harder, because there is no clean ending, no clear betrayal, no definitive moment to point to and say, that is where it broke. There is only you, quietly dismantling something that existed almost entirely inside yourself. And the world will not validate this grief. From the outside, nothing ended, nothing visible was lost. People will tell you to move on from something they cannot even see. They will minimize it with their practicality and miss the point, entirely, that you are not grieving a person. You are grieving an entire future you had already begun to inhabit. That grief is real. Feel it completely. But feeling it completely is not the same as feeding it indefinitely. And this is where the Sophia Stage makes its most precise and unforgiving demand. Grieve fully, then choose to stop. Not when the feelings fade, not when it gets easier. Now, while it still costs you something. Because letting go only counts when it costs you something. That is what separates transformation from mere transition. Every time you reconstruct the conversations, every time you return to the memories like a wound you keep reopening, you are not processing grief. You are maintaining an addiction to almost love because almost love is safer than the real thing. Stop feeding it today. You are not letting go of a person. You are letting go of the version of yourself that needed that love to be real in order to feel worthy of love at all. That is the release. That is the one that changes everything. And it begins the moment you decide your worthiness was never theirs to confirm. So here is what this moment demands of you, not eventually, not when the wound feels smaller. Now, stop eulogizing something that never had a funeral. Stop measuring your worth against someone's inability to see it. Their blindness was never information about your value. It was only ever information about their vision. Today you make one decision, one honest, undefended, self-respecting decision. You decide that the love you are capable of giving deserves a real address, a present person, a mutual choosing, a love that does not require you to translate silence into meaning or interpret absence as hidden depth. You deserve love that does not need to be decoded. Here's the mindset shift that changes everything. You have been treating this unlanded love as evidence that something is wrong with you. It isn't. It is evidence that you are someone who loves with their entire being, and that is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a gift that has simply been misdirected. The capacity was never the problem. The address was. So redirect it. Deliberately, completely, without apology. Grieve today, fully honestly, without rushing past the weight of what you wanted and did not receive. Honor it that much. It deserves that much. And then open your hands. And then open your hands, not because that love wasn't worth wanting, but because you are worth more than a love that only ever existed in the wanting. Stop asking why they didn't choose you. That question has no answer that will ever be enough. Instead, ask the only question that leads somewhere real. Am I finally ready to choose myself? Not as a consolation, not as a substitute for what you wanted, as the beginning of everything you actually deserve. That is not the end of your love story. That is the first honest page of it.